High in the mountains of East Africa, where the clouds kiss the peaks and the ancient winds whisper tales of kings, lies a land unlike any other. A land that was never colonized, never truly conquered. A land of pride, faith, and fire. This is Ethiopia. For centuries, Ethiopia stood as a symbol of independence in a continent carved by foreign powers. Its people traced their lineage not to invaders or settlers, but to legends, to Solomon, the wise king of Israel, and to the Queen of Sheba, whose beauty and intellect echoed through time. It was said that from their union came a dynasty, a royal bloodline that would rule Ethiopia for nearly 3,000 years. And at its heart stood one man, the last emperor of this ancient line, Haile Selassie I. To his people, he was the Lion of Judah, the elect of God, the King of Kings. To the world, he was a symbol of dignity and African pride. He rose to power in 1930 in a grand coronation filled with golden crowns, incense, and hymns. The world watched in awe as a small African nation celebrated a monarch with ancient roots and modern dreams. Selassie promised reform, progress, and unity. He believed Ethiopia could bridge its glorious past with a bright, modern future. Under his reign, schools were built, roads carved through mountains, and Ethiopia's voice grew stronger on the world stage. He outlawed slavery, promoted education, and drafted Ethiopia's first constitution. He became a symbol of progress, not just for Ethiopians, but for Africans everywhere seeking freedom and identity. But his greatest test came not from within, but from beyond his borders. In 1935, Italy, under Mussolini's fascist regime, invaded Ethiopia, armed with planes, tanks, and poison gas. Ethiopian warriors fought with courage, but the odds were merciless. Selassie fled to exile in England, but not in defeat. He carried Ethiopia's struggle to the world stage. Standing before the League of Nations in Geneva, he pleaded not only for his country, but for the conscience of humanity. His words echoed through history. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. Though ignored then, his warning became prophecy when World War II erupted. And when the Allies triumphed, so too did Ethiopia. Haile Selassie returned home in 1941, not as a king restored by power, but as a symbol restored by faith. For the next decades, he would rebuild Ethiopia, modernizing institutions, joining the United Nations, and leading the call for African unity. He helped establish the Organization of African Unity, headquartered in Addis Ababa, turning Ethiopia into a beacon of independence and leadership for post-colonial Africa. But beneath the glory of progress, shadows began to grow. The emperor, now in his later years, was surrounded by loyalists and luxury, but far from the struggles of his people. As Ethiopia modernized, not all shared in the promise. The palace grew brighter, but the countryside grew darker. And somewhere between the throne and the hungry, between pride and poverty, the storm began to form. By the late 1960s, Ethiopia was changing, but not evenly. In the capital, Addis Ababa, cars rolled past new hotels and government buildings. Students filled universities, learning about democracy, socialism, and revolution from books written halfway across the world. But in the countryside, where most Ethiopians lived, Time seemed frozen. Villagers tilled dry soil with wooden plows, just as their ancestors had for centuries. The land, rich in culture and history, was owned by a few, noble landlords and church elites. The farmers, or tenants, worked endlessly, yet remained poor, paying rent in crops while their children went hungry. The emperor's government spoke of reform, but progress came slowly. Schools were few, doctors even fewer. And when famine struck, as it often did in the dry northern lands, it was the peasants who suffered in silence. Haile Selassie was loved by many, but he was also distant, a godlike figure in a rapidly changing world. His court was filled with rituals and royal traditions that no longer matched the needs of the new generation. While young Ethiopians dreamed of equality and revolution, their emperor dreamed of maintaining divine order. Then came the droughts. In the early 1970s, a terrible famine swept through the province of Wollo. Tens of thousands died. Villages withered. Families migrated in despair. But in Addis Ababa, official reports downplayed the tragedy, claiming the empire was stable, prosperous, and at peace. Yet the truth could not stay buried forever. Foreign journalists and relief workers began to reveal horrifying images: starving children, empty fields, and abandoned homes. The world was shocked, and the people of Ethiopia felt betrayed. Students began to march and protest. Teachers demanded reform. Soldiers grumbled about unpaid wages and corruption. The empire that had survived centuries of foreign invasion now trembled from within. But perhaps the emperor did not see it, or did not wish to see it. Surrounded by loyal ministers and ceremony, he continued his daily rituals, feeding his lions at the palace, reviewing guards in their polished uniforms, still addressing himself as King of Kings, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. But the lion's roar was fading. The youth no longer bowed to the crown, they raised their fists in anger. The poor no longer saw him as their savior. They saw him as their burden. And so, while the emperor slept in the palace, Ethiopia began to wake up. In the barracks, the soldiers whispered. In the universities, the students debated. And in the villages, the farmers prayed, not for the emperor's blessing, but for change. The cracks had appeared, and soon they would shatter the empire that had stood for 3 millennia. The Lion of Judah, once unshakable, unchallengeable, would soon face a storm unlike any other. The year is 1973. Ethiopia stands at the edge of history, and the revolution is about to begin. In the early 1970s, the Empire of Ethiopia stood at a crossroads. To the outside world it appeared proud and unbroken, a kingdom that had survived colonialism, a symbol of Africa's independence and identity. But within, a quiet crisis was growing. Ethiopia's beauty was undeniable, from the fertile highlands to the arid plains of the east. Yet, for millions of its people, life was a daily struggle. While Haile Selassie's palace gleamed with marble floors and foreign diplomats filled the banquet halls, the vast majority of Ethiopians toiled in silence, poor, hungry, and unseen. Ethiopia was a nation of farmers. More than 80% of its people lived off the land, but most of that land was not theirs. It belonged to a small group of noble landlords, the church, and wealthy elites. Ordinary peasants worked from sunrise to sunset, only to hand over much of their harvest as rent or tax. In cities like Addis Ababa, signs of modernization could be seen. Banks, hotels, universities. But beyond the city limits, time seemed frozen. In rural villages, farmers still used oxen and wooden plows, and children learned by the glow of oil lamps. The emperor's government had promised reform, but progress came slowly, buried in red tape, old traditions, and the fear of losing power. The young educated generation, especially students in Addis Ababa University, began to question why change was taking so long. They read about revolutions in China, Cuba, and Russia, stories of peasants and workers rising up against injustice, and they began to ask, if others can rise and demand equality, why not us? At the same time, the government's expenses grew. Grand celebrations, new palaces, and lavish foreign trips painted a picture of wealth. But that image could not hide the widening gap between rich and poor. And then, nature delivered a blow that would expose everything. In 1972, drought struck Ethiopia's northern provinces, Wollo and Tigray. The rains failed, crops withered, and rivers dried to dust. At first, few outside the region knew what was happening, but in remote villages, entire families faced starvation. Livestock died, children wasted away. Famine, silent, slow, and merciless, crept across the land. Instead of rallying to save his people, Haile Selassie's government tried to suppress the news. Officials feared that acknowledging famine would damage the emperor's image of strength and prosperity. So reports were censored. Relief was delayed. Meanwhile, foreign journalists began to uncover the truth. They filmed haunting images, hollow faces, starving children, and desperate mothers that would soon shock the world. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. While thousands starved in Wollo, the emperor's court still held banquets and ceremonies in Addis Ababa. While peasants searched for food, government ministers dined on imported delicacies. The illusion of prosperity began to crumble. The people, once loyal and proud, now began to whisper in anger. Whispers became voices. Voices became shouts. And soon, Ethiopia, the ancient empire that had stood for millennia, would tremble under the weight of its own inequality. By 1973, those whispers of discontent had become a roar. Students, teachers, and workers began to organize protests, demanding reform, justice, and change. In Addis Ababa, university students carried banners reading, "Land to the tiller." It became the cry of a generation, a call for equality and an end to the feudal land system. The emperor's regime, unaccustomed to dissent, tried to silence them. Police cracked down on protests, arrested student leaders, and shut down campuses. But the fire could not be contained. Even within the military, frustration was growing. Soldiers complained about low pay, poor living conditions, and corrupt officers who grew rich while they starved. When a group of soldiers in Eritrea mutinied over unpaid wages, the government responded with threats, not solutions. For the first time, the emperor's authority was openly challenged by his own armed forces. At the same time, the famine continued. Aid workers brought food to the north, but corruption and mismanagement meant little of it reached the starving. Villagers began to lose faith not only in the emperor, but in the very idea of the monarchy itself. Foreign journalists continued to expose the crisis. One documentary, aired on British television in 1973, showed the world what the emperor's officials had tried to hide. Children dying in their mothers' arms. Villages empty and silent. Skeletons where people once stood. The world was outraged. But for Ethiopians, it was more than outrage. It was humiliation. Their ancient empire, once admired for its independence and dignity, was now seen as a place of hunger and neglect. Haile Selassie, now in his 80s, appeared increasingly detached. He continued his royal routine, feeding his lions, attending ceremonies, hosting diplomats. But the people had changed. The loyalty that had once surrounded him was fading fast. In cafes and classrooms, people began to talk of revolution, not just reform, but the end of the monarchy itself. Students called for socialism. Teachers called for democracy. Soldiers began to speak in the language of power. Even the Orthodox Church, long a pillar of royal authority, could feel the ground shifting. The old order, built on loyalty, tradition, and divine right, was breaking apart. And then came the moment that turned unrest into uprising. In February 1974, a group of soldiers in the port city of Asmara refused orders. They demanded better living conditions, fair pay, and justice. When the government tried to suppress them, more soldiers joined in. Mutinies spread like wildfire, from the north to the capital. Soon the military, the very force meant to protect the emperor, became the engine of rebellion. In Addis Ababa, a new power began to emerge, a committee of officers calling themselves the Derg, meaning the committee. They claimed they were not against the emperor, but against corruption. They said they only wanted reform, not revolution. But history had other plans. Ethiopia was no longer the land of quiet obedience. The people had found their voice. The soldiers had found their strength. And the emperor, the Lion of Judah, stood alone at the edge of a storm. A revolution was coming, and there would be no turning back. The year is 1974. The land of the Lion of Judah trembles. From the capital to the countryside, from classrooms to army barracks, the old order is cracking. For centuries, Ethiopia's emperors ruled with divine authority. But now that authority stood face to face with rifles, slogans, and hungry stomachs. The spark that began with student protests had spread like wildfire into the ranks of the military, the very institution meant to protect the throne. The soldiers, who had long endured low pay, shortages, and neglect, began to realize their strength. They held the guns. They held the numbers. And soon they would hold the power. In the port city of Asmara, soldiers first refused orders, demanding food, fair pay, and better living conditions. When the government tried to dismiss them as troublemakers, the unrest spread. Within weeks, similar mutinies erupted in the Air Force, the Navy, and even the imperial guards. Haile Selassie's ministers scrambled to contain the chaos, but their words fell on deaf ears. Each new protest inspired another. Each act of defiance pulled another thread from the fabric of imperial control. The emperor's once loyal army was turning into a political force, united not by obedience, but by anger. Amid this growing unrest, a group of middle-ranking officers decided to act. They began to meet in secret, men from different branches of the armed forces, tired of corruption and chaos. They called themselves the Derg, an Amharic word meaning the committee. At first, the Derg claimed no interest in overthrowing the emperor. Their official goal was simple: restore order, investigate corruption, and protect national stability. But power is a dangerous thing, and once it gathers momentum, it rarely stops where it starts. The Derg began quietly. They arrested a few ministers accused of corruption. they took over government offices to protect them. But within weeks, the committee expanded rapidly. By mid-1974, it included representatives from every branch of the armed forces, hundreds of officers. And as their power grew, so did their confidence. Meanwhile, outside the barracks, Ethiopia's streets were alive with protest. Students chanted for socialism, workers went on strike, teachers and civil servants demanded reform. The emperor's government, once the symbol of stability, now seemed paralyzed, unable to make decisions or calm the nation. Food prices soared, inflation worsened, rumors spread faster than truth. And above it all, Haile Selassie, now in his 80s, sat in his palace surrounded by loyal courtiers who told him only what he wanted to hear. He believed his people still loved him. He believed he could still restore order. But outside the palace gates, Ethiopia was already changing forever. The army's awakening was not just a political shift. It was a social earthquake. For the first time in Ethiopian history, the soldiers, the workers, and the students were united by the same cry: change. And at the center of this storm, the Derg was watching, waiting, and growing stronger each day. By the middle of 1974, the Derg was no longer just a committee. It was becoming a government within a government, a shadow authority spreading its influence across the empire. In July, it began arresting high-ranking officials, ministers, generals, even members of the royal family, all accused of corruption and betrayal of the people. The public cheered. For the first time, they saw the powerful being held accountable. The Derg positioned itself as the voice of justice and equality, protectors of the people against a corrupt system. But behind the slogans and arrests, another power struggle was emerging. Who would lead this new movement? Who would speak for the army? Among the Derg's many officers, one name began to rise: a young, ambitious major with fiery eyes and an iron will. He spoke the language of revolution, of equality, socialism, and national pride. To some, he was a hero. To others, a dangerous man with dangerous dreams. Meanwhile, Haile Selassie's position grew weaker by the day. Each morning brought new arrests, new decrees, and new signs of his fading power. Even the imperial guards, once his most loyal defenders, began to waver. Then, in a move that shocked the world, the Derg declared the arrest of Haile Selassie's closest aides, his ministers, generals, and even the prime minister. The message was clear. The monarchy's foundation had collapsed. Music rises, deep, solemn notes. In August 1974, tanks rolled into Addis Ababa. Soldiers surrounded the imperial palace. No shots were fired, no grand speeches made, just the quiet shuffle of boots and the echo of history ending. On September 12, 1974, the Derg made its boldest move yet. They entered the palace and placed Emperor Haile Selassie I, the man who had ruled for 44 years, who had once stood before the League of Nations and the world, under arrest. The Lion of Judah was caged. The oldest continuous monarchy in Africa was no more. Ethiopia, a land that had always looked to its emperors for guidance, now looked toward soldiers for salvation. At first, many Ethiopians believed the Derg would bring fairness, equality, and reform. They hoped the soldiers would return power to the people. But revolutions rarely unfold as planned. As the Derg consolidated its control, internal rivalries grew. Moderates who wanted peaceful reform clashed with radicals who demanded full revolution. And at the heart of it all, Mengistu waited, watching, calculating, preparing to rise. Outside the barracks, students cheered. Workers celebrated. The emperor was gone, and the old world had ended. But in the quiet corners of Ethiopia, some wept. They wept not just for a fallen king, but for the uncertainty ahead. For though the monarchy had ended, the true revolution, and the violence it would bring, had only just begun. The Lion of Judah has fallen. The soldiers now rule, and the revolution has found its generals. The year was 1974, and the world was watching. For months, the streets of Addis Ababa had been alive with anger, chants, and courage. Students, soldiers, workers, and priests, once bound by fear, now stood united under a single call: down with the feudal system, down with oppression. The air carried the tension of change. It was no longer just whispers in coffee houses or leaflets handed in secret. It was open defiance. The once untouchable Emperor Haile Selassie, the Lion of Judah, the symbol of divine power, now found his own empire slipping away. At the heart of this storm was the military, the same institution that had long protected the emperor. But within its ranks, frustration had been quietly growing. Young officers, many from humble backgrounds, were tired of watching their country starve while palace officials lived in luxury. The government had failed to provide fair wages or equipment, and when the famine struck the north, many soldiers were sent to suppress protests instead of helping the hungry. By mid-1974, mutinies had spread through the Ethiopian Air Force, the Navy, and even the Imperial Guard. One after another, military bases rose up, demanding reform. What had begun as protests over food and wages was now transforming into a full-blown revolution. And leading this military movement was not a single man at first, but a committee, a group of officers who called themselves the Derg, an Amharic word meaning committee or council. Their goal was simple at first: restore order, remove corrupt officials, and stabilize the nation. But power once taken is not easily shared, and the Derg soon found itself growing in both ambition and authority. Inside the walls of the Jubilee Palace, Emperor Haile Selassie still held audiences with diplomats, still dressed in his regal uniforms, still carried himself as if he ruled by divine right. But outside those gates, his empire was crumbling. When news of mutinies reached him, he reportedly dismissed them as temporary disturbances, the kind his government had quelled before. Yet the disturbances only grew stronger. In June 1974, the Derg arrested several of the emperor's closest ministers, accusing them of corruption and abuse of power. This was a daring move. Never before had anyone in Ethiopia dared to detain the emperor's inner circle. By August, the situation had spiraled beyond repair. The Derg, now led by Major Mengistu Haile Mariam and other radical officers, took control of the capital. Soldiers surrounded the palace. Roads were blocked. Royal loyalists were disarmed. The emperor's once loyal guard no longer obeyed his orders. On September 12, 1974, the world witnessed a moment that would change Ethiopia forever. Haile Selassie, now 82 years old, was quietly taken from his palace in the back seat of a blue Volkswagen Beetle. Not a royal carriage, not a grand motorcade, but a humble car escorted by soldiers. It was a symbol as much as an act. The emperor, who had once driven in parades through cheering crowds, was now driven through silent streets under arrest. The image was powerful. The Lion of Judah had fallen, peacefully, almost politely, but fallen nonetheless. When the Derg announced that it had deposed the emperor, the reaction was mixed. Some Ethiopians celebrated in the streets, shouting freedom and justice. Others wept quietly, unsure what would come next. For over 3,000 years, Ethiopia had been ruled by monarchs claiming descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a lineage older than most empires, one that had survived foreign invasions, colonial threats, and world wars. And now, in a single day, that royal bloodline had ended. The Derg wasted no time. They abolished the monarchy, suspended the constitution, and declared Ethiopia a socialist state. All royal properties were nationalized. Palaces, estates, and businesses belonging to the nobility were seized in the name of the people. But behind these swift declarations lay deep uncertainty. The Derg had taken power, yes, but it was not yet clear what kind of future they would create. For many Ethiopians, the fall of Haile Selassie was both the end of an era and the beginning of a storm. In the weeks following the emperor's arrest, the Derg moved quickly to consolidate power. Led by Major Mengistu Haile Mariam, General Aman Andam, and others, the committee sought to present itself as the savior of the nation, a revolutionary force that would bring equality, land reform, and justice. Their slogans echoed Marxist ideas: land to the tiller, power to the people, equality for all Ethiopians. To many, this sounded like hope. For centuries, Ethiopia's peasants had worked on land owned by landlords and nobles. Now the Derg promised to give that land to those who actually farmed it. But not everyone trusted them. Some saw in the Derg not liberation, but a new form of military dictatorship. Within months, divisions appeared inside the Derg itself. General Aman Andam, the first chairman, wanted a peaceful transition and an end to the bloodshed. Mengistu and others, however, believed in a hardline revolutionary approach. Tensions grew until in November 1974, gunfire echoed in Addis Ababa. General Aman Andam was killed, and Mengistu soon rose as the most powerful man in the Derg. From that moment, the revolution took a darker turn. After his removal, Haile Selassie was held under house arrest at the Grand Palace. The Derg kept him isolated, his every move monitored. Foreign diplomats were denied access. The once revered emperor, who had dined with world leaders and spoken before the League of Nations, now ate simple meals alone in confinement. Then, in August 1975, the Derg announced that Haile Selassie had died, in his sleep. But few believed it. The official explanation claimed natural causes, but rumors spread quickly that he had been strangled in his bed or suffocated with a pillow. Years later, after the fall of the Derg, his remains were found buried under the floorboards of a palace office, a grim reminder of the revolution's brutality. His death marked the symbolic end of Ethiopia's imperial age. At first, many hoped that the Derg would bring equality and justice. The emperor had fallen, the landlords were gone, and slogans of reform filled the air. But the excitement soon gave way to fear. The Derg began executing officials from the old regime, ministers, generals, and aristocrats, often without trial. In one of the most infamous acts, 60 former officials, including Prime Minister Endilkacho Makonnen, were lined up and shot at dawn inside the central prison. The executions sent a chilling message: opposition would not be tolerated. Over the next months, the Derg's power became absolute. Political parties were banned, the media was censored, and those who questioned the government, even revolutionaries themselves, were branded as enemies of the people. The revolution that had begun with chants for justice was turning into a reign of fear. In the years that followed, Ethiopia would endure civil war, famine, and the Red Terror, a campaign of violence that would claim thousands of lives. But the fall of Haile Selassie in 1974 remained a defining moment, a turning point not only for Ethiopia, but for all Africa. For many, it symbolized the end of old Africa, the Africa of kings and emperors, and the rise of a new, modern continent, shaped by revolution, socialism, and struggle. For others, it marked the loss of stability, tradition, and identity. Haile Selassie had been flawed, even autocratic, but he had also been a symbol of unity, pride, and continuity. His fall left a void that no one could easily fill. As historians later wrote, Ethiopia did not simply overthrow a ruler, it overthrew an entire world. In the twilight of his reign, the Lion of Judah stood alone, not on a throne of gold, but in the silence of his fallen empire. His people, once bound by faith and fear, had risen in defiance. The revolution had triumphed, but at what cost? Ethiopia had slain its monarch to free its people, and yet freedom would prove far harder to find. From the ashes of the oldest throne in Africa, a new order was born, forged not by kings, but by soldiers. And as the storm clouds gathered over Addis Ababa, one question remained. Would this revolution bring light, or only deeper darkness? The year was 1976, and Ethiopia stood at a crossroads. The monarchy was gone. The emperor was dead. The Derg ruled with promises of equality and socialism. But behind the slogans of land to the teller and power to the people, a darker struggle was beginning, one that would stain the revolution in blood. At first, the Derg claimed to represent all Ethiopians. They spoke of justice, of ending centuries of exploitation, and of creating a socialist paradise where no one went hungry. But revolutions rarely follow straight lines. Soon, disagreements began to emerge, not just between the people and their rulers, but within the revolution itself. In the cities, especially in Addis Ababa, students who had helped ignite the revolution were becoming restless again. They had demanded the end of imperial rule, but they hadn't fought for military dictatorship. Many believed that true socialism should come from the people, not from an armed council of officers. One student movement, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, or EPRP, became especially vocal. They accused the Derg of betraying the revolution, of turning it into tyranny. They began organizing protests, publishing underground newspapers, and urging civilians to resist the military government. The Derg, led now by Mengistu Haile Mariam, saw these movements as a direct threat. Mengistu was determined to hold on to power and to destroy any opposition before it could grow. The stage was set for one of the darkest chapters in Ethiopia's modern history. Mengistu Haile Mariam, once a little-known officer, had emerged as the dominant figure within the Derg by 1977. Fierce, intelligent, and ruthless, he believed Ethiopia's survival depended on absolute control. In a dramatic public rally that year, Mengistu made his intentions clear. In front of thousands of supporters, he lifted 3 bottles filled with red liquid. He smashed them to the ground, one for imperialists, one for feudalists, and one for counter-revolutionaries. The crowd erupted in cheers, but the message was unmistakable. Blood would be the price of revolution. Shortly after, he became chairman of the Derg and the de facto ruler of Ethiopia. Under Mengistu, the revolution took a new direction, one that was far more violent, centralized, and ideological. He declared that the Derg would build a Marxist-Leninist state modeled after the Soviet Union. But before that could happen, the enemies of the people had to be eliminated. This campaign of fear and extermination became known as the Red Terror. It began quietly, with arrests, then the disappearances, and then the killings. Between 1977 and 1978, thousands of Ethiopians, students, teachers, workers, even priests, were accused of being enemies of the revolution. The Derg claimed they were spies for imperialists or members of the EPRP. In truth, many were simply people who had dared to speak out. Armed government squads, often called Kebele committees, patrolled the neighborhoods of Addis Ababa. They searched homes, seized young men from the streets, and demanded loyalty oaths. Families lived in terror, never knowing when a knock on the door might come. Victims were often executed in public to send a message. Their bodies were left on display, sometimes hanging from poles, sometimes lying in the open, with signs around their necks reading, "Enemy of the Revolution." It was a time when fear became a way of life. Neighbors stopped talking to one another. Parents warned children to stay silent. Even whispers could be deadly. The Red Terror was not limited to Addis Ababa. It spread across the country to Gondar, Dirdawa, Bahir Dar, and other towns. Rural uprisings were crushed with brutal force. Entire villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned to the ground. No one truly knew how many died. Some historians estimate 50,000 to 100,000 were killed. Others believe the number was far higher. Every revolution has its martyrs, and Ethiopia's were many. One of them was Tilahun Gizau, a student leader who had helped organize protests years earlier. His dream was to see Ethiopia free from monarchy and oppression. But when the Derg took power, Tilahun spoke against their authoritarian rule. For that, he was arrested and executed without trial. His death became a symbol for thousands of young Ethiopians who disappeared during the Red Terror. Mothers would gather outside prisons, waiting for news of their sons. Some carried small bags of food, hoping to deliver them. Guards often told them coldly, "He has been transferred." Those words usually meant one thing, that their child was gone forever. These small human stories, the tearful mothers, the terrified students, the neighbors who vanished overnight, tell more about the revolution's cost than any speech or slogan ever could. Mengistu understood the power of fear, but he also understood the power of propaganda. State-controlled radio and newspapers painted the Derg as heroic defenders of Ethiopia. The EPRP and other opposition groups were labeled terrorists and agents of imperialism. Posters showed images of soldiers protecting the people, and slogans warned, "Revolution is not a dinner party. Beware the enemies of progress." In classrooms, children were taught to praise the revolution and to report any suspicious talk by adults. Citizens were urged to attend rallies, chant revolutionary songs, and display portraits of Mengistu. Dissent was not only dangerous, it was seen as betrayal. Those who fled the country told stories of life under constant surveillance, of spies in every neighborhood, of friends turning against one another out of fear. The revolution that had promised freedom now demanded absolute loyalty. While the Derg tightened its grip on the capital, the EPRP and other resistance groups took up arms. From hidden bases in the countryside, they launched guerrilla attacks against government forces. Addis Ababa became a city of assassinations and counter-assassinations. Derg officials were targeted by EPRP fighters. In retaliation, the government executed prisoners and burned entire neighborhoods suspected of harboring rebels. This cycle of violence deepened the tragedy. Both sides believed they were fighting for Ethiopia's future, yet both brought destruction to its present. By 1978, the EPRP had been largely crushed, its leaders killed or forced into exile. The Derg had won the war for power, but lost the trust of its people. The Red Terror left wounds that would take decades to heal. Families were broken. Schools were emptied. The country's brightest young minds, its students, teachers, and thinkers, were silenced. But even as the killings continued, Mengistu began turning his attention outward. The Derg sought to align Ethiopia with the Soviet Union and Cuba, receiving weapons, advisors, and aid in exchange for loyalty to the socialist bloc. The Cold War had reached the Horn of Africa. With Soviet support, Mengistu felt invincible. He believed he could reshape Ethiopia into a socialist state through force and ideology. Land reform programs were launched. Villages were reorganized into collective farms. Education campaigns taught Marxist slogans. But the human cost remained immense. In many areas, the peasants who were promised land to the tiller found themselves under stricter control than before. The Derg soldiers monitored villages, collected crops, and punished those who resisted. And while the Derg focused on building its new Ethiopia, the old wounds of famine and poverty returned. Drought struck again in the late 1970s, leading to hunger and suffering across the countryside. International aid organizations tried to help, but distribution was slow and sometimes blocked by politics. The people had changed emperors for revolutionaries, but their struggles remained the same. Through all the darkness, stories of quiet courage persisted. Teachers continued to educate children in secret. Priests sheltered fugitives in monasteries. Families risked everything to hide those hunted by the regime. In rural areas, songs and poems became coded forms of protest, reminders that even when fear ruled, the human spirit refused to die. Some survivors later spoke of the strange double life they lived, outwardly loyal to the regime, but inwardly holding on to faith, memory, and love. It was this quiet endurance that helped Ethiopia survive its darkest years. By 1978, Mengistu declared that the enemies of the revolution have been defeated. The Red Terror officially ended, but its legacy of fear remained. Tens of thousands were dead. Families were displaced. The prisons overflowed. Ethiopia was now firmly under one-man rule, with Mengistu at the top of a vast military bureaucracy. He had destroyed his enemies, but also the very ideals that fueled the revolution: justice, equality, and hope. Internationally, Mengistu's Ethiopia became a symbol of both defiance and tragedy. Defiance against imperialism, but tragedy in the scale of its human cost. While the Soviet Union continued to provide support, the rest of the world watched with horror as reports of executions and famine reached global news outlets. The dream of a free and equal Ethiopia had been drowned in its own blood. Looking back, Historians often describe the Red Terror as one of the most devastating episodes in African revolutionary history. It was a time when ideology became obsession, when the dream of liberation was twisted into a nightmare of control. The irony is bitter. The Derg had risen to end oppression, yet it had become oppressor itself. Still, amid the ruins, Ethiopia endured. Its people rebuilt, prayed, and waited for the day when the guns would fall silent and freedom could return. The Red Terror began with promises and ended with graves. It was meant to cleanse the revolution, but it consumed it instead. In the name of justice, thousands were silenced. In the name of progress, generations were lost. Yet through the blood and the fear, the spirit of Ethiopia endured, scarred but unbroken. And as the dust settled over a wounded nation, one truth became clear. Revolutions may start with dreams, but they survive only through mercy. By the early 1980s, Ethiopia had endured nearly a decade of turmoil. The emperor was gone, the monarchy had fallen, and the Derg, under Mengistu Haile Mariam, ruled with iron fists. The country was scarred. Cities and villages bore the marks of violence. Families mourned missing or murdered loved ones. The once proud nation of the Lion of Judah seemed fragile, its people weary from famine, war, and fear. But life went on. Farmers continued to till the land. Children still attended school, sometimes under armed guard, and communities sought ways to survive in an uncertain world. Outside Ethiopia, the global community watched closely. Aid agencies struggled to provide relief during recurrent droughts. International media reported stories of famine and suffering, drawing both sympathy and outrage. Meanwhile, internal resistance continued. Rebel groups in Tigray and Eritrea, among others, fought against the Derg's authoritarian rule. The Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or EPRDF, and other movements organized in rural strongholds, determined to reclaim their homeland and restore some sense of justice. Through all of this, ordinary Ethiopians learned a harsh truth. Revolutions could destroy what they sought to save. Even amid hardship, change slowly began to take root. The Derg, while violent, recognized the need to govern efficiently. It implemented reforms, redistributing land, establishing collective farms, and attempting literacy programs. Schools were reopened, and efforts were made to modernize agriculture and infrastructure. Yet these measures were often undermined by corruption, inefficiency, and continued human rights abuses. The gap between promises and reality remained wide, leaving many Ethiopians disillusioned. At the same time, new generations grew up in this environment of fear and resilience. Students educated under revolutionary curriculum became politically aware. They began questioning authority, discussing new ideas, and imagining a future where democracy and civil rights could exist. In homes and communities, people began to organize quietly. Religious groups offered support and refuge. Families shared resources to survive famine. Ordinary citizens kept alive traditions of Ethiopian culture, music, and literature, proof that identity and spirit could endure even under oppression. By the late 1980s, the Derg's grip on Ethiopia began to weaken. The government was stretched thin, fighting multiple insurgencies while grappling with ongoing economic crises and famine. International support shifted as the Cold War waned. The Soviet Union, Mengistu's primary ally, could no longer provide the same level of aid. The Derg, isolated and weakened, faced a growing coalition of rebel forces determined to overthrow it. In May 1991, after years of struggle, the Derg regime finally collapsed. Mengistu fled into exile, leaving a country battered by violence but ready to rebuild. The coalition of rebel groups took control, marking the end of a long and brutal chapter in Ethiopian history. The collapse of the Derg did not instantly heal the wounds of the past. Families mourned lost loved ones, cities bore scars of war, and distrust lingered in the hearts of many. Yet the overthrow of the dictatorship opened the door for a new chapter, one focused on peace, democracy, and reconstruction. The years following the Derg's fall were a period of trial and learning. Ethiopia faced enormous challenges, rebuilding infrastructure, addressing famine and poverty, reintegrating former soldiers and rebels, and creating institutions that could support democracy and human rights. The new government began to hold elections, draft constitutions, and establish local governance structures. The goal was to empower citizens and ensure that power was no longer concentrated in the hands of a few. Yet the process was not easy. Ethnic tensions, political rivalries, and economic hardship threatened progress. Rebuilding trust in institutions that had been destroyed or corrupted required patience, perseverance, and courage. At the same time, Ethiopia began to reclaim its place on the global stage. Trade resumed, diplomatic relations improved, and aid organizations partnered with the government to tackle famine, education, and healthcare. Slowly, hope began to take root. Education became a cornerstone of recovery. Schools taught not just reading and writing, but also civic responsibility, history, and human rights. Students learned the stories of their nation's past, both the triumphs and the tragedies, as lessons for the future. Ethiopia's revolution of 1974 and the subsequent Red Terror left an indelible mark on the nation. It was a stark reminder of how quickly power can shift, how fragile institutions can be, and how ordinary people can both suffer and endure under extraordinary circumstances. Yet, within that history, there were lessons of resilience. Communities survived famine and oppression. Generations kept alive the culture, faith, and identity of Ethiopia. And in the end, the people reclaimed the promise of freedom, democracy, and justice. The revolution also highlighted the complexity of change. Overthrowing a monarchy did not automatically create equality. Removing one form of oppression did not prevent another from rising. True transformation, Ethiopians learned, requires more than slogans and armies. It requires justice, education, and shared responsibility. Today, Ethiopia continues to grow and change. While challenges remain, economic inequality, political tensions, and natural disasters, the nation has endured. Cities are vibrant, communities are rebuilding, and the people continue to honor their rich heritage. The fall of Haile Selassie, the rise and rule of the Derg, and the eventual path to democracy are more than history lessons. They are reminders that nations are made not by kings or generals, but by the courage, resilience, and determination of ordinary citizens. Ethiopia's story is one of survival, a testament to the enduring human spirit. Even when the world seemed broken, its people found ways to hold on, to hope, and to rebuild. The revolution of 1974 began with the fall of a lion and ended with the rise of a people. For years, Ethiopia suffered under violence, fear, and oppression. Thousands perished, families were shattered. Yet, in the darkest hours, the nation's spirit refused to die. From the ashes of monarchy and dictatorship, a new Ethiopia emerged, one that sought to learn from its past, to honor its heritage, and to build a future rooted in freedom and justice. The story of the Ethiopian Revolution reminds us that history is never simple, that change often comes at a cost, and that the true strength of a nation lies in the courage, resilience, and determination of ordinary citizens. History is not just a story of the past, it is a guide for the future. Take a moment to reflect on the courage, resilience, and lessons of the Ethiopian people. Ask yourself, how can we stand against injustice? How can we work to create a world where freedom, equality, and peace are more than just words? If this story inspired you, share it with friends, explore more about Ethiopia's rich history, and never stop asking questions, because the more we learn from the past, the better we can shape the future.